Becoming chartered with Engineers Australia is expensive. In this video, I'm going to explore at least 3 alternatives that I've found to Engineers Australia that can offer another pathway to chartership for engineers who have probably about 4 to 7 years experience after leaving university. So I've looked at IET, Engineers Ireland or Engineering New Zealand as those alternatives, and I'll go through those in some more detail. My name's Chris, and in this channel I like to share some of the lessons learned and tools that I use to grow as an engineer and to conduct my work as a consultant. So feel free to follow along and hopefully you get some value out of these lessons learned and tools that I'm sharing. So we'll dive right into it. The first one I wanted to look at was Engineering New Zealand. So this is Engineering New Zealand. You can see it there. They have, they're quite equivalent to Engineers Australia in terms of that they offer this CPEng, Chartered Professional Engineer. However, they do, and they don't require you to be a member already. So this first time assessment fee is charged regardless of whether you're a member already or not. But once, see, you don't need to be a member to apply, but once you do apply, there is an annual fee of about 460. These are New Zealand dollars on this screen. So typically all you need is the same degree that you'd have had to join Engineers Australia. However, there is one downside to becoming chartered with Engineering New Zealand, and that's this 6-year requirement to maintain your registration. You must be reassessed at least every 6 years. Now that's a bit different to the other organisations I've looked at, as far as I can tell, because they do require you to stay current and up to date, but I don't believe it's a formal reassessment within a fixed period of time. There are some proof and requirements that you need to go through to maintain chartered status. However, Engineering New Zealand seems to be quite strict by saying you must do it within 6 years. So the next alternative I looked at was the IET. Now this one was recommended to me by a colleague. So part of the Engineers Australia process is they get that peer review. When I was getting a peer review, one of my colleagues was chartered with the IET in the UK. And when he saw the questions involved and the process involved, he said, "Why don't you try the IET?" So at the time, I wish I'd listened to him because I've struggled a bit with the Engineers Australia process and it's quite expensive as well. So the IET is a bit cheaper. The IET, as you can see here, charges this £210 fee to become chartered, as well as £170 per year membership, compared to Engineers Australia's 580 Australian dollar fee plus per year, plus $1,800 to get chartered. So the IET is quite a cheaper organisation. And when I took a look on their website at the requirements, it seemed to be a similar sort of competence demonstration, but there were other ways of demonstrating that you had met those competencies for chartered. So check out the IET as another alternative. I sure wish I'd listened to my colleague when he suggested it. So another one that I've looked at is Engineering Ireland. So I came across this one because I have a colleague who was mentoring a young structural engineer, a civil engineer in London. And this young civil engineer wanted to become chartered with the ICE. So I think it was after the 3rd failure to go through the ICE's chartered process, the Institute of Civil Engineers. My colleague, the mentor, recommended that, spoke to the ICE and said, look, we're going to lose this young engineer because this young engineer is more than competent to become chartered with the ICE. They demonstrate all the behaviours of a chartered engineer of the ICE. However, it was just a procedural or examination or testing problem. And so my colleague, the mentor, he appealed to the ICE on behalf of the young engineers, but unfortunately it didn't go through. The ICE is quite strict on their appeals process. So they lost him. This young engineer went to Engineers Ireland. They didn't have a problem chartering him. He was more than competent. He showed all the behaviours of a chartered engineer and everything that should be done for a chartered engineer. And then he became chartered with Engineers Ireland, still working in London, but chartered with Engineers Ireland. So this is another option for Australians based in Australia, or overseas, any Australians really. To become chartered, you can approach Engineers Ireland and try it that way. So Engineers Ireland charges a membership fee of £280. There is a discount if you're applying from overseas. If you become overseas, so it's €280 or €215 if you're overseas. Then on top of that, you must be a member for at least 3 months first before applying for Chartered, so you do have to pay that membership fee. And then there's an application fee for Chartered of €400. So that's about, what, €680 minimum to become Chartered, which I think is quite a good deal, and a sure sight better than the $2,400 odd that it requires to become Chartered with Engineers Australia. So those are some of the alternatives to becoming Chartered. So that's Engineers New Zealand, the IET or Engineering Ireland. There are further alternatives still depending on your specialisation. For example, I'm come from an electronic software engineer background, so that's why the IET is my sort of default in the UK. If you're a civil or structural engineer, there's the Institute of Civil Engineers, the Institution of Structural Engineers. There's various other things, like there's even one that's the Institute of Railway Signalling Engineers will offer you Chartered Engineer status. So there's a whole list of them on Wikipedia to go through about the different organisations that offer Chartered status, and each of those can be an alternative to becoming Chartered with Engineers Australia. That can be a nice alternative. So hopefully I've given you a few ideas here that there are alternatives in the world to Engineers Australia. You're not bound to Engineers Australia just because you are Australian or you're going to university in Australia. There are other options. So in this channel, I like to share these sorts of lessons learned, as well as the various tools that I've used as an engineer to solve problems and to improve myself professionally. So feel free to follow along if you're interested in that sort of thing, in how to develop and improve as an engineer or as a business person. I'll share those tools regularly over the next few videos. So hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.